Most prognosticators expect Republicans to take the House in 2022. But by how much? How many seats are they going to get? Is this going to be a huge House majority, potentially record-breaking, or a relatively modest increase? And what House races should we be watching? And are there any specific narratives that we should be paying attention to about the types of Republicans that will be entering the House in this new group? For the first time in this election cycle, it is time for a House Race Roundup. I'm Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. And welcome, podcast listeners, to another episode of Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte. I am Dr. A.J. Nolte, Assistant Professor of Government at Regent University's Robertson School of Government. Once again, views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of either Regent University or the Robertson School of Government. Please remember that you can rate and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast provider. We would also like it if you would subscribe and watch our videos on American One. That's American, the number one, your one-stop shop for conservative content on the internet, on politics, culture, and everything in between. So we've done monthly updates on Senate races, on gubernatorial races, but now we're close enough that it's time to actually bring into focus some of the key House races that will not only determine control, but will determine the shape of the new expected Republican House majority. It would be a shocker of biblical proportions if Republicans do not take the House at this point. Republicans, I think, need a net of like 5 seats, maybe 6 to take the House. That would happen in a neutral year. Okay, so in a neutral year, no wave whatsoever, Republicans would probably still take the House just by virtue of a combination of redistricting, a combination of, a couple of seats shifting one way or the other. That's how close this margin really is. But we're not in a neutral environment. And what we're looking at is a playing field that is actually tilted where Republicans are competing in seats that are anywhere from Biden plus 5 to Biden plus 10 in 2020. Now, I don't know that Biden 2020 numbers are the most completely accurate description of where we are in terms of the overall environment. I think what we actually see if we look down ballot is there was a lot of vote splitting, or at least there was a lot of Biden fall off. What I mean by that is a lot of people voted for Biden and either voted Republican down ballot, or they only voted for Biden and then didn't vote the rest of their ballot. So I don't know how accurate that Biden number really is to where we are as a country. And some of that is what we're going to find out in 2022. But there are a ton of races where Republicans are competing, some of which are races they have not been competitive in before. We want to keep an eye on a couple of trends here as we go through this race and these House races. This is going to be a whirlwind tour through the country. We're going to go by region. I want you to keep your eye on a couple of trends. Number one, if we look back at the gains Republicans made in 2020, almost every candidate that won was a woman or a minority. And any candidate who won who wasn't a woman or a minority was a veteran. So we want to look at that trend. Is that trend going to continue of disproportionate gains among new House members in the minority, women, veteran categories? The other thing is, I will be marking some of these races as we go along and say, this one will fall in a neutral year. This one, could go in a moderate wave. And boy, if this House seat flips, Democrats are in real serious trouble. Okay, so we're going to go through, and for some of these races, I'm going to give those categories. I may just list off some of the races that are competitive in each region, and then hone in on specific races as we go. So we're going to start in the Northeast. Not as many competitive seats here, but there are a few. We're looking at New Hampshire's first, Rhode Island's second, Connecticut's fifth, Maine's second, and several seats in New York, ranging from the 3rd, the 11th, the 18th, and the 19th. Couple of interesting notes here. New Hampshire's first, this is Caroline Leavitt versus the incumbent, who is Chris Pappas. I am expecting Republicans probably take this one. It got a slight Democratic tilt, but this is a swing seat that could go back and forth, as you'd expect from New Hampshire. This should fall in a neutral year to slight Republican lean. On the other hand, Connecticut's 5th district, this is a reach seat for Republicans. You have the incumbent, I think her name is Johanna Hayes. Republican challenger is a guy by the name of George Logan, who is African-American. He's a son of Jamaican immigrants. want to say it's Jamaican, and then maybe his mom was from somewhere in Spanish-speaking Caribbean, if I'm remembering correctly. I could be wrong on that. I apologize if I am. But George Logan is a very interesting candidate as well. If George Logan is winning, and polling has shown him very close, this is a bad night for Democrats, because Connecticut's 5th district is definitely a reach seat for Republicans. Rhode Island's 2nd is probably going to go to the GOP. And this is a really interesting seat. It's open. Jim Langevin is retiring. Democrats have the incumbent treasurer, Seth Magaziner, as their candidate here, but Republicans got an outstanding recruit in Cranston Mayor Alan Fung, who's run a couple of times statewide, hasn't won, but he fits his district very well. He's worked his district hard, and actually public polling has shown Fung ahead here. So we should expect this to be a seat that falls, and that should worry you if you're a Democrat. On the New York seats, if the 3rd, which I think that is, some of these is hard to track because, frankly, they've changed all the numbers around due to redistricting. And so I'm going to give you candidates where I can, because I'm not sure all my numbering is correct. Because of, especially in New York, they went through like 5 or 6 different maps, so it's hard to keep track. But George Santos is the Republican running in this seat. The seat is open, as Tom Suozzi, who was the previous incumbent, ran for governor. The seat also changed a little bit in redistricting. If Santos wins, really bad night for Democrats. Also, probably indicative of Hochul seriously underperforming in the governor's race. The two that I'm really keeping an eye on, I have the 11th on here, but I expect Nicole Malliotakis will win, and win convincingly in her Staten Island-based seat. But that's probably the only chance Republicans have of losing a seat in New York. I'm not expecting that. 18 and 19 are going to be interesting, because these two seats are seats in which the two candidates who went up against one another in that narrow special election victory for Democrats in August are running for separate seats. Pat Ryan, I believe, is in the 18th. Mark Molinaro, I believe, is in the 19th. It would be a pretty much expected result, I would say, if Molinaro and Ryan both won, based on the sort of terrain of those two seats. The Molinaro seat is a little bit redder. The Ryan seat is a little bit bluer. If Molinaro loses, then some of the suburban seats probably are staying with Democrats based on social issues, and they're not voting the economy as much. If Ryan loses after winning the special election, that tells us that Roe is dead, long live inflation, and it's going to be a bad night for Democrats across the suburbs. Okay, so those are seats to watch in the Northeast. Mid-Atlantic, we're looking at seats in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Pennsylvania, the two Democratic incumbents that I'm looking at who could be losing their seats are Susan Wild and Matt Cartwright. Their seats have changed a little bit in redistricting, but they're both facing rematches, I believe, against their challengers from 2020. Those races were pretty close last time, in a better environment for Republicans, especially in Pennsylvania. I think it's Jim Bognett and Lisa Scheller, I believe, are the names, and I would expect both of them to be pretty close. One fun seat to keep an eye on, that, again, this is a bad night for Democrats if this one is falling, and that is Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh-based, I believe the number is 10, but again, they changed them all 1,000 times. Democratic candidate is Summer Lee, who is a squad-type Democratic socialist. Here's the irony. The incumbent in this seat who retired is a guy named Mike Doyle. The Republican nominee is a guy named Mike Doyle. It is not, in fact, the same Mike Doyle. But how many people will pull the lever for Mike Doyle? Either because they don't like a socialist, or they're just so used to voting for Mike Doyle. So if there's a flukish upset in Pennsylvania, it's going to be Mike Doyle winning in Pennsylvania, which would be, I don't think, the first time that you've ever had a seat go from a person of one party to a person of another party who share the same name. But it's an interesting trivia point if that does in fact happen. In Maryland, I'm looking at the 6th district. This is a Frederick-based seat that goes into Montgomery County. David Trone, the owner of Total Wine, is the Democratic incumbent, who is a gazillionaire who has a habit of not showing up to work. His opponent is Neil Parrott, who is, I believe, a state representative or state senator from the Frederick area. This one could go either way, but it probably is indicative of at least a moderate to relatively high wave if this one is falling for falling for the Republicans. In Virginia, we have a perfect, three-part. Republicans are having an okay night, or even kind of a meh night if this is the only one that falls, a decent night if they get 2, an outstanding night if they get 3. Okay, so Virginia's 2nd congressional district. This is a seat Republicans should take in a neutral year. This is also the seat in which I live. Elaine Luria is the incumbent. She's smart. She's runs hard, works her district hard. But she is a down the line vote for the liberal agenda in the House. She is also facing terrain that has gotten redder as parts of Norfolk were dropped and parts of Suffolk were added in redistricting. And so the seat moved, I think, 3 or 4 points. And it also just geographically makes a certain amount of sense. I think the seat also picked up a little bit of Chesapeake. And Jen Kiggins is just an outstanding recruit. She's run a very good race. The Republican outside groups have been hammering Luria on negatives. Kiggins has been running a lot of positive ads. Kiggins is going to win. I would be shocked if Kiggins does not win this race. And so the next one is the 7th. This is Abigail Spanberger versus Yesli Vega. Spanberger is the incumbent, but her terrain moved a little bit. The seat actually got bluer in redistricting, including a bit of Northern Virginia, parts of like Prince William County. And so Vega is an El Salvadorian immigrant who has worked in law enforcement and has been a supervisor up there in Prince William County. She's running as a strong conservative, but has a compelling background. Spanberger has not wanted to debate Vega. It's always a bad sign when you're ducking debates. This one is, a lot of prognosticators have it as a toss-up. I think in this environment, Vega's probably a slight favorite just because of how big the wave is getting. And then there is the 10th district. This is a Northern Virginia-based district that's Loudoun County, Prince William County. The incumbent is Jennifer Wexton, who knocked off Barbara Comstock by 10 points in 2018. She's in her 2nd term. Her challenger is Hung Cao, who is a retired naval officer of Vietnamese descent, who is running a really strong campaign, won the convention, Firehouse Convention, and has been a good candidate. This seat is just such a reach for Republicans at this point. But if Hung Cao is winning, it's a really bad night for Democrats. We're looking at some serious tsunami territory if Hung Cao is beating Wexton. So Virginia is actually a nice handy barometer for how big the wave is. If Luria is the only one who loses, it's a trickle. If Vega beats Spanberger, it's a moderate wave. If Cao beats Wexton, we are looking at a tsunami. And so Democrats should brace themselves for the biblical flood. In North Carolina, really the only bellwether that I'm looking at is North Carolina's 1st. Don Davis, who is an African-American state senator, more moderate, relatively speaking, running against a sort of bold progressive candidate in the primary, won with the support of AIPAC and a lot of other more sort of moderate aligned groups, should be favored over his opponent, who is a fairly Trumpy Republican named Sandy Smith. I think if the other Democrat and the other Republican in the primaries had been nominated, we'd be looking at a race that would be a lot closer. If Sandy Smith beats Don Davis in this race, again, we're looking at a tsunami. Moving on geographically to our SEC states. There's nothing happening in South Carolina, so we're just going to skip that. There's nothing happening in Alabama in terms of House races, so we're going to skip that one as well. Georgia, looking at a couple races. Georgia 6th is going to be a Republican win. That is a seat the Republicans are picking up due to redistricting. Rich McCormick is the nominee there. Rich McCormick is probably going to Congress. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the 2nd. This is a black plurality district based out of the Albany area in Albany, Georgia. Sanford Bishop is the incumbent. He's probably one of the last genuine blue dogs left. He's certainly one of the last moderate African-American members left. His opponent is Chris West, who was considered by sort of Republicans to be the less promising of their 2 candidates in the primary, but Chris West won the primary. Bishop is leading in the polls by a very narrow margin based on some of the polling that is out there. If West wins again, this is a serious wave. However, we want to look at this with a little bit of caution because a very similar district in 2010, the Republican came close, but was not able to beat Sanford Bishop. Bishop should hold on here. I won't say he's wave proof, but it's a pretty big wave if he's being washed out. Moving on to Florida, Republicans are on the offense here because of a very strong map and a very strong environment. I'm looking at races featuring Anna Paulina Luna. I believe that district number is 13. Laurel Lee is in the 15th. That should be a Republican pickup. Luna, this is the old Charlie Crist district, so it's hard to say. But I would say in the environment, she could be sort of washed in there. One of Democrats' few reach targets that they've been going for is in the 27th. That's Maria Elvira Salazar, who is a Republican incumbent. I expect Salazar probably will win. Her opponent is Annette Taddeo, who jumped down from the gubernatorial race, but I think Salazar is going to hold out, and the polling seems to indicate that is, in fact, the case. Last, but certainly not least, in the SEC, and we know that you are an SEC state, although you also have some schools in the Big 12 that are abandoning the Big 12 for the SEC. We are, of course, talking about Texas. And there are a bunch of races in Texas. I'm not going to hit them all, but I want to hit on the three that I think people have been following a lot, which are Texas 15, 28, and 34. The three amigas, right? So we've got Mara Flores in 34. We've got Cassie Garcia in 28. We've got Monica de la Cruz Hernandez in 15. These are three seats based out of the Rio Grande Valley. And I think Republicans have a decent shot at getting them all. 28 and 34 are currently listed as toss-up, and 15 is leans Republican. I think de la Cruz is all but a shoe-in. I think Garcia, that seat is close. Flores winning would be a little bit of an upset, but she is definitely running a stronger campaign than Vicente Gonzalez. And the RGV is moving right, and that tilt seems to be consolidating, and so that's something to keep an eye on. Just another race that's not competitive, but that is indicative of some of the trends that we're talking about of increasing diversity in the Republican caucus is Texas 38th, where Wesley Hunt is going to stroll comfortably into the seat after running a very close, well-run race in 2020 against a Democratic incumbent. We are expecting Hunt to cruise into this seat. He is an African-American military veteran, so he checks off two of those boxes that I said we're looking for where the Republicans making gains. Hunt definitely will be taking that seat, I believe. And so, it would be one interesting prop line to be watching is how many African-American Republicans are there going to be in Congress at the end of the night. And I think we could get as high as the high single digits, and that would be a significant change from previously. Right now there are two. I think we could get as high as maybe 7 or 8. Moving on to the Midwest. In Ohio, we have two Republican potential pickups. Ohio's 13th is Madison Gilbert versus Amelia Sykes. I think Gilbert's going to win. Should be favored to win that race. That would be, I think, a pickup for Republicans in a Republican trending open seat. The 9th, you have Marcy Kaptur, who's a long-term incumbent. Her opponent is a guy by the name of J.R. Majewski. He is kind of one of these MAGA candidates that got in who has not run the best campaign, but could be brought in on a wave. Probably expect Kaptur to be slightly favored to take the seat based on what I'm hearing from sources in Ohio. However, wouldn't be totally shocked again in a giant tsunami. Majewski is the kind of candidate who would get carried in there. And then again, Democrats have one seat that they're trying to take. That is Steve Chabot in Ohio's first. Redistricting made his seat a little bit bluer, but I'm expecting him to hold on there. I'm not really expecting a lot of losses for Republicans in this environment. Indiana, there's one race I'm looking at, and that is Indiana's first incumbent Democrat, Frank Mervan, is running against Jennifer Ruth Green, who is an African-American military veteran. Note the theme. Ruth Green has run an excellent campaign. Things are very close. Politico did a really dirty hit piece on her, where they actually outed her as a survivor of sexual assault against her permission. That's the kind of thing that does not play well. And I don't necessarily think the Mervan campaign leaked it, but I wouldn't necessarily put it past everybody in the Indiana Democratic Party. So Ruth Green has a decent shot. This is one of the first races that we'll be able to see. And if Ruth Green wins, then we are looking at a pretty substantial wave. It's hard to say that that is indicative of a tsunami, but this is probably your first bellwether, right? So if you're watching early returns, if Republicans are winning in Indiana's first district, it's going to be a good night for them overall. Not much happening in Wisconsin. I'm expecting Derek Van Orden, who is the nominee for Republicans in the 3rd Congressional District against Ron Kind last year, to take the seat that is now open as Kind is retiring. That seat is also a little bit redder in redistricting. In Illinois, it's hard to say exactly which races are the most competitive. So let me tell you the candidates that I'm watching. In the 11th, I'm watching Catalina Lauf, who is a Trump administration official of Guatemalan descent on her mother's side. Her dad was a prominent businessman in the Chicagoland area. Lauf is running a strong campaign against Bill Foster, who is the Democratic incumbent. In the 13th, we have, I want to say the Republican candidate in the 13th is Regan Deering, and I'm blanking right now on who the Democrat is that Deering is running against. That's a little bit more of a reach target, as I understand it, for Republicans in that seat, but it's certainly possible. It's an open seat. The Democratic candidate is Nikki, I think, Buczynski, perhaps. Deering is being outspent and outraised, but it's a good environment for Republicans, so that one is potentially on the board. In the 17th, this is another open seat. Cherie Bustos is retiring, and the seat got a little bit redder in redistricting. Esther Joy King, who ran a strong campaign in 2020, should have a decent shot at that one. Michigan has a lot of action. And two of the Republican nominees in this state are African American, although they have very different profiles within the party. So in the 3rd, this was the seat that was repped by Peter Meyer. He lost in the primary to John Gibbs, who's a very strongly MAGA candidate who was pushing some of the Stop the Steal stuff. He's also an African American. I think he might be a veteran as well, just to stick with that theme, and is running against a Democrat, Hillary Schulten. In theory, Schulten should be favored in this race, but in this environment, you could see Gibbs coming in on the wave. 7 and 8 are very competitive. 7 is Alyssa Slotkin. Her opponent is Tom Barrett, who's a local state senator. I think Barrett should be slightly favored in that race. 8 is a toss-up between the current scion of the Kildee family and Dale Kildee. I think it's Dan this time. Is running against Republican Paul Jung, or it might be Young. Not sure exactly how that's pronounced. I mostly have looked at it in writing. That one's, I would say, pretty close to a toss-up at this point. And the 10th, which is a seat that Republicans should win, John James, African-American, military veteran, candidate who has run for Senate twice and lost very, very close races, should be favored to pick up an open seat against his Democratic opponent, who's a guy by the name of Carl Marlinga, who I think is a local judge. James should be favored in that race, and I believe, based on the contours of that race, he is probably going to win that one. Minnesota, we're looking at the 2nd congressional district. This is a rematch between incumbent Angie Craig and her challenger Tyler Kistner. The most interesting thing about this race is that there is a pro-marijuana party that has had candidates on the ballot twice in a row die in the middle of the campaign. So whatever that party is, if you're offered the nomination in 2024 for this race, just don't take it. It's cursed. And so I don't know how that one's gonna break out. It depends on how things go in Minnesota, but Kistner is one to keep an eye on. Kansas, you have the 3rd congressional district. Amanda Atkins is the Republican nominee. Sharice Davids is the incumbent. In a good night, Atkins should take that seat. Iowa's 3rd congressional district. Zach Nunn is the Republican candidate. Cindy Axne is the Democratic incumbent. Nunn is a veteran, I believe. He is also currently a state senator. He should be favored to take that seat as well. Moving on to our final region, we have the West. Republicans have competitive races in Colorado's 7th and 8th congressional districts, I believe. The 8th is one that I'm watching closely, Barbara Kirkmeyer. This is an open seat that is created due to redistricting and should be highly competitive. Kirkmeyer is a pretty strong nominee here. Republicans, I believe their nominee in the 7th is Eric Odland. Again, that should be a potentially competitive seat as well. In Arizona, Republicans are competing for the 1st, 2nd, and 6th districts. The one I want to highlight in particular here is the 6th. Juan Ciscomani is the Republican nominee here. He's a highly touted recruit, Hispanic Latino descent, fits the district pretty well, is running a pretty strong race. Sneaky possibility for an upset in the 4th Republicans nominee. I think there is Tanya Contreras-Wheelis, but if Contreras-Wheelis is making this competitive, it's a really, really bad night for the Democrats. I'm expecting Republicans to take 1. 2 should be a jump ball, and 6 I think is slightly leaning toward Republicans at this point. Nevada, we have 3 competitive House races, 1, 3, and 4. All of these races were kind of made a little bit swingier in redistricting, and the Democrats were hoping for a 3-2-1, where they would get one sort of solid Republican seat, and then they would take the other three. There's a pretty good chance they go 4-0. Republican's strongest nominee is in the 3rd district, which is April Becker is her name, and she is, I think, a slight favorite in that race. Dina Titus is the incumbent. She's complaining about her districting better and redistricting. That means they're not liking what they're seeing in the internals. And then 4 is, I think, Stephen Horsford's district, and the Republican nominee there is Sam Peters. In 1, it's Mark Robertson. Hard to say how 1 and 4 are going to go. I think 3 is going to flip to the Republicans. 1 and 4, I think the Republicans do have a decent shot at. So, watch Nevada. Watch not just Nevada is a key state to watch because we've got contests for Senate, for governor, and for House. Oregon has a surprising number of competitive House races. The second, I think this used to be the 4th. The incumbent here was Kurt Schrader. He lost in a primary to a progressive challenger, Jamie McLeod Skinner. Republicans also got a pretty solid nominee, Laura Chavez de Remer, who's a local mayor, sort of a more moderate Republican, Hispanic Latino descent. Chavez, I think, is a slight favorite over McLeod for this seat that it got a little bit redder in redistricting. In the 6th, you have Alex Skarlatos. He is a military veteran with a compelling story of having thwarted a terrorist attack on a train and then having a movie made about it by Clint Eastwood. So even if this race wasn't competitive, we'd have to talk about Alex Skarlatos because what a great profile for running for Congress. But Skarlatos is definitely in a competitive race in that newly created 6th congressional district. Democratic nominee is Val Hoyle, who is sort of an establishment figure in that race. It's really going to depend on the fundamentals of what happens in Oregon, but that one could be competitive. And then Oregon's 4th district, I think it's the 4th now. Republican nominee there is a guy named Mike Erickson. This was not one people would have thought would be on the playing field after the primary. However, polling has shown this race significantly close, so Erickson could be somebody who is brought in on the wave as well. California has a bajillion races, so I will try to focus on just a few that could be pickups. The 9th congressional district, Republicans nominee is something that could only happen in California. Mike Tyson's former boxing manager and coach, as well as someone who is a local official in that, I think it's the one of the valleys over there. I can't even remember which valley it is. I think it's the Central Valley, maybe. His name is Tom Patty. In the 13th, Republicans nominee is John Duarte. He's a local farmer. That is a sort of an Inland Empire, I think, ish type district over there. I will acknowledge that I'm not the strongest on California geography, so please do forgive any oversights. Those are 2 seats that Republicans have a decent shot at picking up. Territory Republicans are trying to hold that could be swingy just because California is a blue state, and blue states and California is just hard for Republicans even in a good environment. So we want to watch out for David Valadao. He's an incumbent, one of the people who voted for the Trump impeachment. He's probably the one who's the most likely to survive, him or Dan Newhouse, perhaps. His opponent is Rudy Salas. You want Valadao to win, even if you're a Trump supporter. He's another vote for McCarthy for Speaker. He's another vote to stop Democrats from doing all the horrible things they want to do. So it's time to bury the hatchet on some of this stuff and just move forward. In 27, Mike Garcia is a Republican incumbent. His seat is pretty blue, but Garcia is a strong incumbent. He's a fighter. He won this seat, Hispanic Latino descent, veteran, won this seat in a special election in 2020, held it. If he holds on here, he is going to be somebody who is a pretty strong candidate on the not always great bench for Republicans. We're also looking at 41. This was a seat that was in play for a while. Incumbent is Ken Calvert. Calvert should hold out in this environment. Michelle Steele also has a competitive race in the 45th. She's a freshman. But again, I think Steele should be slightly favored in this environment. And then there are 2 pickup opportunities for Republicans that are also on the board. 47, this is Katie Porter's district. The Republican challenger is Scott Baugh, who's a local member of the Assembly. Baugh, I think, has a decent shot at keeping this race close and competitive. Porter is one of those candidates who the progressive sort of netroots folks, if you remember that term, love. So beating her would be particularly satisfying, I think, for California Republicans if they can pull it off. And then in the 49th district, you have Mike Levin is the Democrat, and Brian Marriott, who is a local town official, is the Republican challenger running against him. So that is a whirlwind tour. And the last frontier, Alaska, of course, Mary Peltola won that special election for Democrats. I don't know if that's going to happen again for her in the fall. It just depends. Honestly, Palin and Begich need to bury the hatchet. And the way things work in a ranked choice system is, especially if you've got multiple Republicans, guys, play nice and make sure that your supporters rank the other Republican second. This is how we keep seats in the Republican column. Okay? Learn a lesson from the Republicans in Virginia who had a ranked choice primary. And everybody was super nice to everybody else because why? You want those supporters of the other guy to rank you second. It does not behoove you in a ranked choice environment to fight with one another. So stop it. Stop it. We need to keep seats in the Republican column. And it doesn't really matter from the Republican side if it's Palin or Begich in terms of making sure Republicans have House control, making sure Republicans are able to prevent Democrats from codifying Roe, making sure Republicans are able to prevent Democrats from doing a whole bunch of other horrendous things. So pick whichever one is your preference for first place, but in second place, hold your nose and vote for the party and rank the other Republican people in Alaska. Okay? So that's going to do it for this roundup. A lot of races that we're going to be following. And if you want to see how those races play out, then you should tune in on election night to American One, because we are going to be doing election night coverage. Myself, my compadre, and partner in crime, Scott McJunkin, from our joint appearances on the Backstage show that we've been doing. We are going to be here covering all of these races and more, because I guarantee you there's going to be one or two races that pop on that nobody saw coming. That's what happens in a wave. Republicans will win a crazy race somewhere that nobody saw coming. And so we are going to be covering it all for you here on election night on American One. So join us to follow all of these races. That's going to do it for this episode. Please remember to rate and subscribe on all your favorite places and watch us here on American One. And for Blind Politics, this is Dr. Nolte signing off.